Unseen Enemy by Matt Edzan. Narrated by Matt Edzan. Part 2. Chapter 9. Captain's Ready Room, UHA Hornet. Gibson sat at his desk and looked around the room. It was old and worn out. When he had been informed to report to his new vessel, Gibson had expected a brand new vessel fitted with the latest technologies and weaponry and a clean captain's ready room. But as he had stepped onto the vessel a few hours ago, he had been stunned to find himself inside an older, beaten-up heavy cruiser. Even the hull looked like it had seen better days. He wondered how many captains before him had sat in this very room and engaged the enemy. It had only been a year since he had left UHA. If someone had told him then that he would be back, he would have scoffed and ridiculed them. When he had been ushered out of UHA, he had sworn an oath that he would never look back at the place. As he pressed on the workstation, he realized his oath and pride had become meaningless casualties of life's circumstances. He was certain those who mocked him for retiring were now mocking him for returning to duty. Those people would never stop mocking him. Gibson sighed, letting his imagination run wild. But Gibson knew he couldn't focus on those things which were out of his control. This mission was unlike any other one. It was personal. He pulled out his own datapad and brought up an image of his wife and daughter. An ode to happier times. This was the only family photo left of them. He had to dig deep into his datapad to uncover it. He had always been at peace leaving the past behind. The past only held pain and regret for him, nothing else. The image had been taken 7 years ago during his shore leave right before the Pinnacle War had turned against humanity. He had lost track of his daughter until Hutchinson had revealed that she had been kidnapped by the new enemy. Gibson hadn't known what to feel the moment the Rear Admiral had told him about his daughter. He still didn't like the fact that UHA was using his daughter as bait, but Gibson felt a stirring in his heart. Maybe it was impossible to let the past stay dormant. He had to find his daughter because she was the only family left. Laura was more like his wife than him, and that had led to Laura becoming a scientist and finding her own path to serving and helping humanity. An icon appeared on his display. It was an incoming connection. Gibson narrowed his eyes. It was about time Hutchinson spoke to him. Hutchinson's face appeared. Gibson, I hope. Gibson interrupted him. What is this junk you have given me command over? It isn't junk, Hutchinson glared. The UHA Hornet is one of our proudest vessels. Gibson rolled his eyes. Of another era. Hutchinson shrugged. I cannot do much with this vessel, let alone find a technologically superior enemy, Gibson complained. Hutchinson appeared to dismiss his concerns. This will have to do. UHA has already raised their alert level to Red 1. I don't have time to find you another vessel. Anyway, I'm here to talk about a special passenger that will be joining your mission. Gibson raised his eyebrows. What special passenger? A Poruk captain will be joining our mission in the role of an advisor, Hutchinson announced. Stop joking with me, sir, Gibson said. I'm not. What the heck are you saying? Gibson roared. Are you saying I need to babysit a Poruk spy? Yes, Hutchinson said firmly. That's the agreement between us and the Poruk. This is a joint mission, but this captain will only be an advisor. Gibson was seething with this new revelation. Hutchinson had cleverly and intentionally left out this bit of information when they had spoken in Lyceria. Since when do we do joint missions with our sworn enemy? Since today. I remind you that the Poruk and humanity are currently at peace. Currently was the critical word, Gibson thought. This sounds crazy and you know it, Gibson said. He was on the verge of screaming at the Rear Admiral. How could UHA even allow a Poruk on board one of their vessels? It was unthinkable, let alone a major security risk. You are to work together with the Poruk captain, Hutchinson ordered. And if I refuse, then you may never find your daughter. The threat was a simple but clear one. Gibson looked pointedly at Hutchinson. How dare the Rear Admiral use his daughter as a bargaining chip in this mission? Is that clear? Hutchinson demanded. Gibson grunted and the display went blank. Now he knew why he was stuck in this junk of a vessel. It had to do with the fact that a Porukian military officer would be on board. Chapter 10, Captain's Ready Room, UHA Hornet. There was a buzz at his door. "Come in," Gibson growled. He was still reeling from Hutchinson's treachery of sending on board a Porukian spy when a young woman sauntered into the room. She stopped and saluted him. "Captain." "And who are you?" Gibson asked. "Your XO, Commander Chavon," the young woman replied. "Don't joke with me, officer," Gibson barked. The young woman looked mortified. "I'm not, sir." Gibson looked at her squarely. "How old are you?" "I don't understand." "It isn't a trick question," Gibson remarked. "When did you graduate from UHA Academy?" "1 year ago, sir," Chavon replied. "I hope this isn't your first posting," Gibson scowled. "But it is, sir." Gibson placed his hands over his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was hearing from this young XO. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Chavon inquired. "I realized you had boarded the ship and forgotten to come to the bridge. I was waiting for you there." "I hadn't forgotten anything," Gibson countered. His XO was even younger than his own daughter. Was this a suicide mission? Was Hutchinson taking revenge for the things of the past? Was that it? He was tempted to call Hutchinson on the spot and ask him. However, he realized it would be a futile attempt. Everything had been perfectly planned by the UHA. There was no going back now. "Of course, sir," Chavon said calmly. "How old is this vessel?" Gibson inquired. "Excuse me, sir? I don't think you have a hearing problem, right? How old do you think this vessel is?" Chavon's face turned pale. I don't know. If you're going to be an XO on this vessel, that is something you should find out." Chavon nodded reluctantly. Gibson decided to make do with what he had. "What's the status of the vessel?" "All crew is accounted for and all departments reported they are ready," Chavon replied. It was time to again test the young XO. "How certain are you of their readiness?" His XO looked puzzled. "I don't understand." "Since this is your first posting, I suggest you meet with the different heads of departments in person and ensure all is ready," Gibson barked. "Then submit the readiness report to me." Chavon looked shocked but recovered quickly. "Yes, sir." As his XO turned about to leave, Gibson stopped her. "One more thing. Do you know of our special passenger?" Chavon turned around and smiled. "Yes, sir. UHA Central sent me the profile of our Porukian guest." "She isn't our guest," Gibson hollered. "I didn't mean," Gibson eyed the young XO. "I don't care what you meant, but I want you to welcome her and keep an eye on her, and I again remind you that she isn't our guest." "Then what is she?" Chavon asked. "That's what I intend to find out," Gibson growled. Dismissed. Chapter 11, Engineering, UHA Hornet. Commander Chavon stepped outside of engineering. Chief Engineer Monroe had been a bit unhappy that she had come down to check on his readiness. Although Chavon had highlighted that she was following the captain's orders, Monroe had simply ignored it. Monroe was an experienced engineer and Chavon had felt the pressure of her inexperience manifest itself. She had to control her rapid heartbeat as the eyes of those in engineering bore down on her during her conversation with the chief engineer. Initially, when Chavon had heard the news that she was going to be posted at XO, she had been incredibly excited. After graduating from the academy, she had been working at a desk-bound job that was going nowhere. Although she had graduated near the top of her class, her initial posting had demoralized her. She never understood what led to that posting and even began to doubt herself. But over time, she had decided to stay at a desk-bound job until an opening came up. The UHA Hornet hadn't been her ideal choice, but Chavon had been desperate to take any posting on any vessel. She had also heard that the interest level amongst her peers for the posting on the UHA Hornet wasn't strong, which had been the final incentive that pushed her to choose the vessel. When she had first stepped onto the UHA Hornet, she had found herself amongst many experienced crew who headed the different departments. While there were an equal number of junior officers spread out over the vessel, they were all scattered. The first meeting with the heads of departments had been an exercise of her patience. All the heads of departments had done multiple postings on different vessels. They were seasoned individuals. Every one of them had eyed her with disdain as she had gone through what needed to be done to prepare the vessel for launch. Chavon knew she faced an uphill task in getting around the crew, but she was determined. She hadn't done so well in the academy and suffered through a desk job to give up just because she didn't have the respect of the crew. She refused to let a bunch of hard-nosed crew get the better of her. Her father had been a captain and so had her grandfather. This was what she had always wanted to do and no one was going to stop her. With or without their respect, she was going to succeed. Siobhan walked to the hatch and waited for her Perukian guest. She didn't know what to expect. Then she heard a clanging sound. Siobhan turned in the direction of the sound and took a step back. A tall figure came up the ramp into the hatch and stopped in front of her. Siobhan blinked her eye. It was the Perukian. A female Perukian. It was the first time being so close to one of them. The female Perukian was easily more than a foot taller than her. Siobhan had heard that the Perukian were taller, but it still hadn't prepared her for the female standing in front of her. "I'm looking for the XO," the female Perukian announced. Siobhan's heart shivered, but she forced a smile. "That's me. My name's Commander Siobhan, the XO on this vessel." "You are the XO?" the female Perukian repeated. Siobhan nodded while ignoring the female Perukian's shocked expression. "My name is Captain Surly from the Poruk Empire. Welcome on board the UHA Hornet," Siobhan said. "We've been expecting you." She struggled to not let the Perukian's words affect her. Although she had gotten a similar reaction from most of the crew, Siobhan hadn't expected it from the female Perukian, but it didn't matter. Siobhan would prove all of them wrong soon enough. Surly must have sensed her inner struggle. "I'm sorry if I sounded rude, but you didn't meet my expectations." "It's a common first reaction," Siobhan said. "Let me show you to your compartment." "I'd like to meet your captain first," Surly insisted. "He's quite busy at the moment preparing for the launch of the vessel," Siobhan said. That was a lie. Gibson hadn't told her anything about bringing the Perukian to meet him. Siobhan hoped that the Perukian couldn't sense that she was lying through her teeth. "I understand," Surly agreed. "Lead the way to my compartment." Chapter 12, Captain's Ready Room, UHA Hornet. Gibson looked at his console. The UHA Hornet had left orbit from Beta 1 a few hours ago. His XO had been diligent in checking in with all department heads and submitting their readiness report. He hadn't expected her to follow through on his orders so patiently. Maybe there was some hope for her. Now he had to deal with his Perukian spy. His XO had informed him that the female Perukian was looking forward to meeting him. Gibson had tried his best to postpone the initial meeting as long as he could. His XO had been smart enough not to question his delaying tactics, but now he had to face the female Perukian. The information sent by UHA Central hadn't revealed much about her except that she had been a captain who had fought in the Pinnacle War. That itself was sufficient information for him to be on guard. There was a buzz at the door and Siobhan stepped in, followed by the female Perukian. Gibson didn't flinch. He had encountered many Perukians during the war, some in command but many mere soldiers. None of those encounters had ended well. "Thank you, Commander," Gibson nodded as he gestured to the female Perukian to their nearest chair. Siobhan nodded and left the room. The female Perukian walked up to him and bowed. Gibson returned the bow. He was well versed in Perukian protocols. When dealing with a former enemy over a protracted war, knowing the finer details had been critical. "Captain Surly reporting for duty," Surly introduced herself. "Although you can just call me Surly." Then Surly took her seat. Gibson decided to get down to business. "As you may be aware, we have left orbit and are about to enter the neutral zone. We will then follow a route through the neutral zone." "Yes, Captain," Surly nodded. "I understand this is where you spotted the enemy ship during the war." During the war. Gibson didn't like the way the Perukian said it, but this wasn't the time and place for it. He had a mission to accomplish and a daughter to save. No one was going to stop him from getting it done, and certainly not this Perukian. He also found her insinuation about the position where he had spotted the enemy ship ironic. Gibson knew the Poruk Empire had no clue where he had spotted the enemy ship. If they had such intelligence, Surly wouldn't be seated in front of him right now. Instead, the Poruk Empire would have sent several vessels to find the enemy ship on their own. But now, the Poruk had to follow him. For a proud Poruk species, it was a bitter pill to swallow. "How much do you know about this mission?" Gibson asked. Surly stared at him. "Our mission is to find the enemy, gather the relevant intelligence, and report back to our respective superiors. Is there something I'm missing?" Gibson shook his head. "That sounds about right to me." He suspected she was hiding things. There was no reason for the female Porukian to tell him the truth about her real mission. She wasn't merely here to be an advisor. That would be a waste of sending a Porukian captain. If advising was the original intention, the Poruk Empire could have sent a junior officer, but they chose to send a captain. Gibson found that decision disconcerting. Do you know that you are the first Porukian to ever step into a human war vessel as an advisor? Shirley looked confused. I didn't know that. I thought our species had. Gibson waved his hands. Of course we have trade and all that between our species, but I'm talking about a vessel of war. It had never happened before. Shirley nodded. Prior to his meeting with her, Gibson had tried his best to remember everything he could about his multiple encounters with the Poruk. Unfortunately, he couldn't remember many details. A lot of it was a blur, probably a side effect of all the alcohol he had consumed during his short stint in retirement. Thinking back, he should have had more control over his Lytherian drink. He was beginning to regret that he had let himself lose self-control. Trust is something that will take time between our species, Gibson remarked. That's a natural process which will take time, Shirley commented. I neither expect you to trust me nor I you. Gibson was surprised by her forthrightness, but he had to admit that was the truth. Because of that, I would like you to be careful with your interactions with my crew, Gibson warned. Be careful in what way? Just because there has been a peace treaty, the effects of war last many generations. I need to ensure your safety while you're on board. The last thing Gibson wanted was to have some harm come to Shirley and he be imprisoned for igniting a new war. Shirley replied as she lifted her right hand. I assume the comms ban is because of your concerns for my safety. That's right. Commander Siobhan has the matching comms ban. She has been assigned to help you throughout this mission. You can always reach her at any time through the comms ban. Gibson sensed that this female Porukian was highly intelligent. If not, the Poruk Empire would have never put her on board his vessel. Thank you for your concerns, Captain, Shirley remarked. I assume you will let me know once we reach the area where you had previously detected the enemy vessel. Gibson grunted. He was going to have to be extremely careful with her. After all, she had been a captain during the war. That meant she was well versed with handling herself during the war. He had heard stories of many Porukian captains not surviving well after the end of the war. However, it seemed Shirley was pretty composed and focused. That itself was another worry he didn't want to deal with. Then the klaxon sounded in his room. Chapter 13, Bridge, USA Hornet. Shirley stepped onto the bridge. This was the first time ever any Porukian was probably setting foot onto a human vessel's bridge. She glanced down at the comms band, which she knew was there to monitor her whereabouts. It was to be expected. The humans would never trust her. War had a way of sustaining the behavior and habits of individuals. She found herself looking for her neural implants only to remember she didn't have them anymore. The lack of neural implants made her feel vulnerable. It was the first time since she was posted to her first Poruk command that she didn't have her neural implants. Imperial Command had been quite clear that things such as the neural implants couldn't be taken on board a human vessel. Their fear was that the technology behind it might fall into human hands. Imperial Command was justified to force her to remove her neural implants. The removal process had been surprisingly pain-free, although after the medical procedure it had felt like she had lost a part of her body. Shirley scanned the bridge as Gibson went and took a seat at the captain's chair. Captain on the bridge, Siobhan announced. Although Shirley had seen the human's bridge from her own vessel, the perspective was very different from actually being on the bridge. While she despised humanity, her orders had also been to use this opportunity to find out more about them. This mission was her only chance to do it in case a future war ever started again. The intelligence gathered here could be invaluable. She tried her best to take note of everything in front of her. The layout of the bridge was different from the Poruk Command Center. It had a curved structure with consoles scattered throughout the perimeter of the bridge. Another set of consoles were in the middle, presumably for the captain and XO. Shirley was surprised that there were many more humans on this bridge. It appeared as if the humans preferred to have many designated officers for different roles. That was highly inefficient of them. It was so much easier to have a single Poruk take on multiple roles. Then again, there were many things she didn't understand about how humans worked. Report, Gibson barked. We just exited hyperspace and encountered 2 vessels of unknown origin the moment we stepped into a neutral zone, an officer at the front replied. Gibson looked at her and then returned his gaze to the view screen. Shirley didn't like the way he stared at her briefly, but she knew what the captain probably suspected. Those two vessels had been waiting for signs of any other vessels entering the neutral zone. It was as if they were guarding the neutral zone. Although the neutral zone was a vast area of space of which some was uncharted, it wasn't claimed by any species, even after the end of the Pinnacle War. So, in theory, there shouldn't be such vessels about. Gibson turned to his XO, hailed him. Another officer shouted, "They're powering up their weapons." "I got an incoming message," Commander Chavon reported. "Shields up," a third officer reported. "Do not engage them," Gibson ordered. "Put them on the view screen." Captain Gibson didn't appear too excited by the prospect of encountering these two vessels. However, his bridge crew and XO seemed visibly worried. It was an obvious sign of an inexperienced crew. She frowned. Why would UHS send an inexperienced crew on such a critical mission? She had even been stunned by Commander Chavon. The female human had been honest that this was her first posting, and this vessel itself wasn't a new one. When Shirley had walked up to the hatch, the evidence was clearly written all over the hull. This was an older vessel. What were the humans up to? It didn't make sense to send an inexperienced crew in an older vessel to seek out an unknown enemy who was technologically superior. Was it a sign that the humans are not taking this unknown enemy seriously? If that was the case, it was a glaring error. Two males appeared on the screen. They were both wearing armor and covered in hair from top to the bottom. The moment their faces with their hollow yellow eyes appeared, Shirley recognized them. What was the Toaxi species doing in this part of the neutral zone? Their homeworld was a distance away. "You're trespassing in our space," the first Toaxi growled. "This is the neutral zone," Gibson said calmly. "No one has a claim to this space." "How dare you question us," the first Toaxi shouted. "We'll fire upon you if you do not leave this space immediately." Gibson signaled for his comms officer to cut the transmission. The view screen went blank. "Does anyone have any ideas?" Gibson asked. "Sir, they may fire upon us," Chavon highlighted. "They might," Gibson said, "but I doubt the Toaxi would do that." Shirley was surprised that Gibson knew the species. She hadn't expected that from him. "Toaxi," the XO stammered. "That's the species we were just talking to," Gibson remarked. "I ran into them before during the war. The Toaxi species likes to talk like that most of the time. It's simply talk and no action." Gibson's assessment was crude but accurate. Shirley didn't know why the UHA had chosen him as captain for this mission. Nothing about him assured her that he was capable of successfully completing the mission. "They're targeting our hull," the third officer announced. Gibson didn't seem impressed by that. "Keep your fingers on the trigger." Shirley's thoracic senses had begun to warn her. Something wasn't right with this Toaxi vessel, but she didn't know what it was. She stepped forward. "Captain, may I try?" Chapter 14, Bridge UHA Hornet. Captain Gibson eyed her for a while. He hoped his long stare would make her uncomfortable. He didn't know why she wanted to interfere in his business. She was only an advisor on this mission. She didn't even have to be present on the bridge. But he decided to let her try. He could sense all eyes on the female Porukian. "Be my guest," Gibson said. "Hail them again." "Incoming transmission," the comms officer reported. The view screen changed and the two male Toaxi appeared again. This time they looked angrier, but Gibson didn't care. The Toaxi species looked like something that had emerged from humanity's history generations ago. To him, they were harmless. They only thought they could defeat their enemies through their tough talk. But that was all it was, just talk. He had been tempted to fire upon the Toaxi and teach them a lesson. However, that would have been a waste of his weapons. He needed to manage his resources for the real enemy out there. Shirley walked to his right. The two male Toaxi aliens' eyes widened. Gibson smirked. They had never imagined that a Poruk would be present on a human vessel, let alone the bridge. Today was their lucky day. "I didn't know, Captain Shirley, that you were on board," the first male Toaxi bowed. Gibson stroked his chin. Now he was surprised. Apparently his Porukian spy was well known amongst other species, or at least the Toaxi. They seemed to respect her. That was an interesting turn of events. He glanced at his XO, who still seemed mesmerized by the Toaxi species and hadn't picked up on the implications in the conversation between Shirley and the Toaxi. He guessed that this was his XO's first encounter with an alien species in space. That probably was also true for most of his bridge crew. Gibson suppressed a sigh. Why had he ended up with such a crew? Someone at UHA Central must have had a serious grudge to grind with him. He should have pushed Rear Admiral Hutchinson for more answers to the rationale of being given an inexperienced crew and older vessel. Yes, we are on an important joint mission, Surly said firmly. Do you have any reason to stop us? The first male Toaxi smiled. Of course. We understand now why the human vessel is here. Let me talk to my crew. The sound of the transmission was cut by the Toaxi. The two male Toaxi began a fierce and intense discussion amongst themselves. Gibson nearly laughed out loud as the Toaxi gestured with each other. It was apparent that the conversation included others on their ship. The Toaxi were a strange species. They liked to get involved in boisterous conversations amongst themselves. And most of these conversations lasted a long time. He had been a witness to a few Toaxi conversations during the war. It had only further proved of the incompetence of the Toaxi species. I think we can forget about, Gibson started. Surly raised her right hand. Captain, give me a moment. Gibson was annoyed. What was she doing? They had already stopped the conversation with the Toaxi species. The XO gestured to him to give Surly some time. That itself made him angrier. He was in charge of the bridge. Out of courtesy, he had given Surly the chance to talk to the Toaxi in the hopes of diffusing the tension. However, he had no intention of letting the female Poruk advisor dictate what he can and cannot do on his bridge. Surly continued to stare intensely at the view screen. Gibson didn't understand what was happening. Was this a Porukian thing? Didn't she understand they were on a human vessel? Gibson had run out of patience as he stood. Look. Surly turned to him. The look on her face sent shivers down his spine. The Toaxi are going to board this vessel and kill us all. Gibson raised his eyebrows. How the heck do you know that? Part of my experience led me to learn to lip-read the Toaxi species amongst others, Surly replied. Gibson frowned. Are you telling me that those two Toaxi are discussing all of that in front of us? Surly nodded. As you are aware, the Toaxi species isn't a strong species. They do things in strange ways. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, just like now. They don't seem to care that they're discussing our destruction while we are on their view screen. Was she really telling the truth or making up a story? Gibson wasn't able to read her well enough, but he had to admit that the Toaxi weren't that tactful. They're powering down their weapons, the sensor officer said. Gibson sat back down and turned to Surly. I think you may have misread them. I did not, Surly insisted. I don't know how they're going to do it. All I can say is that they're going to do it. Captain, their launch tubes are being opened, the sensor officer said. Gibson leaned forward and looked at the view screen. Something was happening. He couldn't discern it clearly. Magnify on the first vessel, Gibson ordered. The view screen zoomed in on the first Toaxi vessel. His eyes widened as a dozen small objects shot out of the launch tubes of the first Toaxi vessel. What are those? His XO asked. Gibson recognized those small objects as Toaxi crew in spacesuits. What were the Toaxi up to? He had never known them to do such a thing. Surly turned to him. Captain, reverse now. Do it, Gibson barked to his crew. Chapter 15, Bridge, USJ Hornet. I don't understand, Siobhan whispered. Gibson didn't completely get it either, but he had a suspicion. Somehow the Toaxi species had evolved. They weren't the same species he had encountered many years ago. He couldn't figure out what had happened to them, but they had changed and so had their tactics. He would have never imagined the Toaxi being so bold to shoot their warriors out of the launch tubes. It wasn't in their blood to even try such a thing. Those Toaxi crew aren't going to make it over to us, the tactical officer said. I think they're crazy. What do they think they're doing? They don't need to, Surly pointed out as she turned to Gibson. He understood what she was implying, although he himself didn't believe it was possible. But Surly's facial expression said otherwise. Keep us moving away, Lieutenant, Gibson said. But they won't ever reach us, the tactical officer countered. That's an order from your captain, Siobhan shouted. Gibson was taken back by the fury in his XO's voice. She was really trying a bit too hard, but he was glad she had stepped in. His crew was becoming an obstacle. The tactical officer kept quiet as Gibson felt the ship lurch in reverse. The Toaxi launchers have stopped in space, the sensor officer reported. It's like they run out of velocity. Gibson waited for the inevitable. His crew couldn't understand what was about to happen, and he didn't want to try and explain it to the crew, at least not until it happened. "What are they?" the tactical officer's voice trailed off. "They're shrinking." The sensor officer said, "I don't believe it. They're gone. Where did—" The sensor officer was interrupted by a sound on the right side of the bridge. On that side, a white light appeared, temporarily blinding everyone. Gibson stood and took out his weapon. Surly took a few steps back. Then there was a thud, and an armed male taxi appeared on the bridge. The male taxi was standing on his feet but seemed dazed by its arrival on the bridge. Intruder alert klaxons began to wail throughout the bridge and the vessel. Gibson didn't wait for his crew to react. Instead, he raced towards the male taxi and tackled him before he could discharge his weapon. The taxi never saw him coming and crashed to the ground. As Gibson wrestled with him, Surly pounced on the taxi and knocked him out with one kick to the head. Surly had her foot firmly planted on the male taxi's chest. Gibson felt pain shoot up his back. It had been a long time since he had ever fought anyone. Gibson slowly stood without touching his back and glanced around. His crew was still in a state of shock. His tactical officer's mouth was half open. His XO was at least standing, but even she hadn't made a move. Most of them hadn't even moved from their stations. Gibson suppressed a sigh. If he hadn't attacked the male taxi, most of his crew would be dead by now. "Commander, get teams to check the vessel deck by deck," Gibson hollered. "There should be more taxi on board. Find and neutralize them immediately, and then put all of them in the brig." His XO mumbled something before marching off the bridge. Gibson hoped she was up to the task. This wasn't a drill. It was a real-life assault on their vessel. "Someone shut off the klaxon," Gibson ordered. "Captain, the second vessel is launching more of those taxi," the sensor officer highlighted. None of his crew had yet moved to restrain the unconscious male taxi. What was wrong with them? This wasn't a game. Everyone's lives were at stake. "Someone put some restraints on this taxi," Gibson said, "and get us out of here now." He was exasperated with the slow reaction of his crew as the UHA Hornet jumped into hyperspace. Chapter 16, Deck 1, UHA Hornet. Commander Siobhan gripped her weapon tightly as she motioned her officers forward along the corridor. The armored vest she had quickly put on was heavier than she had expected. Siobhan looked at her weapon. This would be the first time using a weapon out in space. She anticipated that such a time as this would occur, but she had never imagined it would come so soon. That, to her, had been a mistake. She needed to be ready for anything. This wasn't the academy. People could die easily out here. Siobhan felt the UHA Hornet jump into hyperspace. She guessed the captain had decided to evade the taxi vessels, which was a wise thing to do. The sensor officer had detected an energy surge at the end of Deck 1. It had been similar to what had occurred on the bridge. She had ordered teams to comb through all the decks while personally taking charge of the team for Deck 1. Siobhan refused to stay on the sidelines of this attack by the taxi. It was her duty to follow her captain's orders to the letter. The taxi species were out to attack and destroy the UHA Hornet. Their boldness in launching such an attack was the only evidence anyone needed. But she refused to let them succeed in their assault on the vessel. If she couldn't handle such an attack, all her days of academy training amounted to nothing. The incident on the bridge had left her speechless. She still couldn't believe how the captain had been the first amongst the crew to tackle the male taxi. The captain hadn't even flinched when he had raced forward. Her heart had been pounding as the captain had grappled with the male taxi. She had never expected the captain to be so fast in his reaction. Despite that, her feet had been stubbornly rooted to the chair. As quickly as it had begun, it came to a sudden end. Surly had leaped forward and rammed her feet against the male taxi, knocking the alien out. That itself had woken Siobhan up from a state of shock. However, she had only managed to stand. Pangs of guilt had consumed her. She should have been there right next to her captain helping him, but she hadn't. Instead, she had been initially seated in a chair as if she had been a spectator to the intrusion. Had she been trying to avoid dealing with the taxi alien? She couldn't afford a repeat of such a situation ever again. Both the captain and Surly's actions had revealed how far she had to go in learning to lead a vessel. She sighed, knowing that she was nowhere near their capabilities. She had been equally disappointed with her bridge crew. None of them had even come to their captain's aid. All the preparation and drills they had done before the launch had been meaningless. They had been more like a waste of time. Siobhan tried to push those thoughts aside as she focused on the corridor. Lieutenant Shaw, cover the rear, Siobhan said. Shaw took a step back as Siobhan led her team further down the corridor. Siobhan opened the comms with the sensor officer. Which room did the energy surge come from? Last one on your left, the sensor officer replied. Siobhan took a deep breath as she approached the door to the room. This was a storeroom with nothing of significance inside, but it appeared to be a location where a Toaxi may have been transported into. It may have been an intentional location that the Toaxi aliens would have chosen. Yet, how were the Toaxi aliens able to transport through their shields? That notion had kept nagging at her ever since she had left the bridge. She signaled both her officers to either side of the door. Her heart was racing. The fear she had when walking down the corridor had been replaced with adrenaline. The second her hand touched the panel, an explosion ripped through the door. The door dissolved into nothing as Siobhan felt her body being thrown into the air. She landed against the opposite wall but was glad she hadn't been completely knocked out. Siobhan blinked a few times and shook her head only to witness Lieutenant Shaw fighting with another male Toaxi. Her other officer was unconscious on the floor beside her. Siobhan aimed her weapon as Shaw and the male Toaxi wrestled with each other, but she couldn't get a clear shot at the male Toaxi. The two of them began to roll on the corridor floor. Both their weapons were strewn across the floor. Siobhan stood and hurried over to the fight. The two of them kept rolling further down the corridor. Shaw was a foot taller than the Toaxi, which he leveraged upon to neutralize the male Toaxi's agility. Siobhan aimed and fired her weapon once at the male Toaxi, but it missed its target. She tried again, but it hit the corridor. Commander, get ready, Shaw shouted. Siobhan stood aside and waited for the moment. In an incredible display of power, Shaw lifted the male Toaxi on his back and shoved him forward towards her. Siobhan leaped backwards while firing her weapon. This time, she didn't miss. Her weapon's fire hit the male Toaxi multiple times. The male Toaxi collapsed in the corridor and with wounds across his chest. It was dead. Nicely done, Shaw said as he gathered himself up. I didn't know you could wrestle so long with them, Siobhan observed. I think it was still days from his transport over to our vessel, Shaw said as he picked up his weapon. We got lucky this time. Despite his recent fight with the male Toaxi, Shaw seemed calm and composed. By this time, her other officer had gotten up and was shaking his head. Both of you take the alien away, Siobhan ordered. Yes, sir, the two officers acknowledged in unison and left her alone in the corridor. Siobhan spoke to the sensor officer. Any other energy surges on this deck? Negative, the sensor officer replied. Siobhan breathed a sigh of relief and walked into the storeroom where they had initially found the male Toaxi. She listened, but there were no sounds. Then she buried her head in her hands. The adrenaline rush was gone. Doubts began to plague her mind. Was this what she had signed up for? If Lieutenant Shaw hadn't been there, would she have survived the attack by the male Toaxi? She couldn't answer those questions, not now. Against her family's opposition, Siobhan had enlisted into UHA. Her family had been adamant that the UHA didn't suit her character, but she always had a fascination with defending humanity from aliens. Siobhan never knew where the passion came from, but it had been with her since a young age. Living through the Pinnacle War had only increased her desire for her choice of career. When she had graduated from UHA Academy, none of her family members had been there to support her. It had been a lonely moment, but she had taken that moment as a challenge to prove her family wrong. It had made her more determined to succeed and show everyone she deserved to be part of the UHA. Siobhan hated thinking about the past. It didn't help her. When she had gotten her posting to this vessel, she had tried to call and tell her parents of the news, but they had refused to even listen to her. Instead, they had warned her about taking the posting. Siobhan had recalled her mother arguing with her. Siobhan couldn't understand why her family couldn't accept and trust her decisions. Once she had boarded the UHA Hornet, she had accepted the fact that her family may never approve of her choices. Siobhan knew this wasn't the time to dwell on her family and their lack of respect for her personal decisions. Her captain needed her to be alert. Something was wrong with this Toaxi alien species. In both her encounters with the Toaxi, she had found it strange that the male Toaxi had been dazed and confused after their successful transport onto the vessel. Part 2, The End.